Walk the block between 26th and 27th Streets in Manhattan Beach today, and you will find a lifeguard training facility, a row of county buildings, and a parking lot facing the Pacific. Nothing marks what stood there before. No foundation, no plaque at street level, no trace of the lodge that once rented rooms to black families who had driven 15 miles from Central Avenue just to touch open water. The land was taken in 1924. The reason given was a public park. No park was built. This is the story of Bruce's Beach, what it was, who destroyed it, and what California finally admitted nearly 100 years too late. Charles and Willa Bruce came to Los Angeles from New Mexico in the early 1900s, part of the steady migration of black families drawn west by the promise of less restrictive racial codes than the Deep South enforced. California was not the South, but it was not free either. Restrictive covenants kept black families out of most neighborhoods. Hotels turned them away. Public beaches, though technically open, made black visitors unwelcome through harassment, refused service at nearby businesses, and the silent consensus of white bathers who would simply leave when black families arrived. The Bruces understood what most black entrepreneurs of that era understood. If you wanted access, you built it yourself. Charles Bruce purchased 2 oceanfront lots on a block between 26th and 27th Streets in Manhattan Beach sometime around 1912. The lots faced the Pacific. The sand was wide and clean. And for the first time on this stretch of the Southern California coast, black families had a beach of their own. Willa Bruce operated a lodge and a cafe on the property. The resort attracted black visitors from across Los Angeles County, families who packed into cars on weekends and drove from the Central Avenue corridor to reach open water. Other black families bought property on the same block. A small community formed. By the early 1920s, the area around 26th and 27th Streets had become a gathering point, a social anchor, and one of the only beachfront spaces in California where black Americans could swim without confrontation. The beach was never large. It occupied a handful of lots on a single block. But what it represented was enormous. In a state where sundown towns dotted the coast and black families learned early which beaches would tolerate them and which would not, Bruce's Beach was a place that belonged to them. The resort grew through word of mouth. Families came from Watts, from the West Adams district, from Pasadena and beyond. They came on holidays and on ordinary Saturdays. Children played in the surf. Couples walked the sand after dark. The cafe served food. The lodge rented rooms. Other black property owners on the block ran their own small businesses. The Strip functioned as a self-contained social world, a place where black families did not need to navigate the daily calculations of where they were and were not welcome. For roughly a decade, it worked. The Pacific was open. The sand was theirs. And for a brief stretch of California history, a handful of black families owned oceanfront property in a town that would later become one of the wealthiest communities in Los Angeles County. It was not only recreation. The beach represented something that black Americans in early 20th century California almost never possessed: a deed to land that faced the ocean. Ownership of that strip of sand meant that no hotel clerk could deny them a room, no lifeguard could wave them away, no sign had to be read and obeyed. The property itself was the permission. That fact alone made it dangerous to the people who lived around it. White residents of Manhattan Beach did not accept the arrangement quietly. Almost from the beginning, the Bruce family faced organized hostility. Neighbors filed complaints. Local businesses refused to serve black visitors who wandered beyond the beach block. The Ku Klux Klan, which operated openly in Southern California during the 1920s, targeted the area. Klan members reportedly cut the tires of cars belonging to black beachgoers. Crosses were burned. Threatening notes appeared. The harassment was not random. It was designed to make the daily operation of the resort so difficult, so dangerous, so exhausting that the Bruces would simply give up and leave. They did not leave. Charles and Willa Bruce continued operating the lodge and cafe. Other black property owners on the block held on. The community endured the threats and continued using their beach. But the campaign of intimidation accomplished something else. It created a political environment in which the city government could act. The harassment established a pretext. If black families and white families could not coexist peacefully on that stretch of beach, the city reasoned, then the city had an obligation to intervene. The solution the city chose was not to protect the black families from harassment. It was to remove them entirely. In 1924, the Manhattan Beach Board of Trustees voted to condemn the properties on the block between 26th and 27th Streets through eminent domain. The stated purpose was the construction of a public park. The condemnation targeted every black-owned lot on that block. The city offered the property owners compensation, but at prices well below what the oceanfront land was worth. Some owners fought the condemnation in court. They lost. Eminent domain gave the city the legal authority to take private property for public use, provided it paid fair market value. The question of whether the intended use was genuinely public, or whether the entire proceeding was a racial removal dressed in legal language, was not seriously examined at the time. The Bruces received roughly $14,000 for their 2 lots. Other black families on the block received similar below-market payments. By the late 1920s, every black-owned property on that stretch of Manhattan Beach had been transferred to the city. The families dispersed, the lodge closed, the cafe shuttered. The beach that had served as a gathering point for Black Los Angeles for over a decade ceased to exist. The city of Manhattan Beach owned the land. The promise was a park. The condemnation was not unusual in its legal form. Cities across the United States used eminent domain throughout the 20th century to acquire private land. What made this case distinct was the precision of its targeting. The condemned properties formed an exact map of black ownership on that block. White-owned lots adjacent to the site were not touched. The legal tool was neutral. Its application was not. No park was built, not in 1925, not in 1930, not in 1940. The lots sat vacant for years. The city eventually transferred the land to the state of California, which later transferred it to Los Angeles County. The county built a lifeguard training facility and a parking lot on the site. For decades, the land that had been seized under the legal justification of public park use served no park function at all. This was the quiet part of the theft. The loud part was the condemnation vote, the Klan harassment, the forced sales below market value, but the quiet part was what came after. Nothing. The city took the land, removed the families, and then did not do the thing it said it needed the land to do. The lots between 26th and 27th Streets became a county facility and an expanse of asphalt. The ocean was still there. The sand was still wide and clean. But the black families who had owned it, who had built something on it, who had created one of the only beachfront spaces in California where they were welcome, were gone. The legal mechanism had worked perfectly. Eminent domain required public purpose. The city declared one. The courts accepted it. And when the purpose never materialized, no legal remedy existed to undo what had been done. For most of the 20th century, Bruce's Beach existed only in the memories of the families who had been there and in scattered references in local history. Manhattan Beach grew into one of the most expensive real estate markets in Southern California. The lots that Charles Bruce had purchased for a modest sum in 1912 sat in a zip code where single-family homes would eventually sell for millions. The irony required no commentary. A black family had owned oceanfront property in what became one of the wealthiest beach towns in America, and the city had taken it from them for the price of a used car. The Bruce family descendants knew the story. the community remembered. But for decades, no official acknowledgement came. The land had been legally transferred. The courts had ruled. The families had been compensated, however inadequately. By the standards of American property law, the matter was closed. In 2020, following renewed attention to the history of racial dispossession in America, the story of Bruce's Beach entered public consciousness in a way it had not before. Local activists and descendants of the Bruce family pushed for the land to be returned. The case became a test of whether California was willing to do something almost unprecedented in American property law: reverse a century-old eminent domain seizure on the grounds that it had been racially motivated. In 2021, the California State Legislature passed a bill authorizing Los Angeles County to transfer the land back to the descendants of Charles and Willa Bruce. Governor Gavin Newsom signed it. In 2022, the county completed the transfer. 2 parcels of oceanfront property, the same lots Charles Bruce had purchased over a century earlier, were returned to his great-grandsons. The Bruce family descendants subsequently sold the land back to Los Angeles County for approximately $20 million. The transaction was voluntary. The family chose to sell. But the sequence mattered. The land was returned first. The family's ownership was restored. And then, from a position of legal ownership rather than legal dispossession, they made their own decision about what to do with it. The transfer did not undo a century of lost wealth, lost access, and lost community. It did not rebuild the lodge, or reopen the cafe, or give back the decades of beachfront ownership that the Bruce family would have passed down through generations. What it did was force the state to name the act. California admitted, through legislation and executive action, that the 1924 condemnation had been a racial taking disguised as public planning. The admission itself was the rarest thing in American property law, a government conceding that it had stolen from its own citizens along racial lines and then acting to reverse the theft. Whether the reversal was adequate, whether $20 million compensates for a century of compounded loss, is a question the law does not answer. The Bruce family accepted the terms. The state closed the file. Today, a small park sits at the top of the bluff above the beach in Manhattan Beach. It is called Bruce's Beach Park. A plaque tells a version of the story. The park is not on the original lots. It is nearby on higher ground, overlooking the ocean. The original lots, the ones Charles Bruce purchased, sit below at street level. They are county property again, purchased back from the family for $20 million that the Bruce descendants now hold instead of the city holding their land. The sand is still wide, the water is still open, but no black resort operates there. No black-owned lodge faces the waves. The space exists as what California made of it: public land, serving public functions, owned by the county. The families are gone. The community that gathered there for a single decade in the early 20th century left no physical structure behind. What remains is the documented record, the condemnation vote of 1924, the property transfer records, the Klan activity reports, the legislative act of 2021 that named the taking as racial, and the $20 million that a great-grandson received for land his ancestor purchased for a fraction of that sum in an era when black families could own almost nothing. The ocean does not remember who owned the shore, but the records do. Bruce's Beach was not the only black beachfront seized in California. It was not the only black community removed through eminent domain dressed as public interest. It was one of dozens of such takings along the American coastline, from the Inkwell beaches of the East Coast to the Gulf Shore retreats of the South. What made it unusual was not the theft. What made it unusual was that California, nearly 100 years later, gave it back,